Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Tuesday. I thought tonight I'd talk. I saw one of the movies over a weekend. I thought I'd talk about some um, spaghetti westerns tonight. So, um, if you talk about spaghetti westerns, you have to talk about Sergio Leone um, and his first three spaghetti westerns. He actually only did not make that many movies, most of them westerns. Um, the Bad and the Ugly. Um, First one definitely kind of. I'm sorry, Good, Bad, and Ugly was the third one. Let's backtrack here. Fistful of Dollars was the first one. It was actually based on a Japanese film from a few years before called Akimbo, and actually the Sergio Leone had to pay um, the original director or actually give him the rights to Japan in the market because he pretty much just took his story and redid the film as a western. And all these films were. This was kind of the breakthrough one. After that, there was kind of a flood. Sergio only made a couple more. All his films were the better ones, if you ask me. But um, some interesting production thing is that they could do it in Italy cheaper. They shot some in Spain and Germany as well, but they would shoot them cheap, labor wise. And they would try and get a star from America, a couple stars from Italy, and other European stars. And that way, they would actually shoot with no sound at the time of production. And then they would loop the audio afterwards. And that's part of why all the sound effects always sounded kind of loud and fully, but gave the movie's character. But so everyone would say their lines in their native language during the actual shoot, and then they would loop the audio in post production. But Fistful of Dollars was the first one. And that kind of broke the gates open when it did well in America. It was on MGM Films. And then Fistful of Dollars was the sequel. And that was the first one to bring in Lee Van Cleef. My understanding was they were looking for Henry Fonda, but he wasn't available. And someone suggested Lee Van Cleef, and that's what they ended up with. See if we can get a little bit of music here. Um, so that was the follow up. And then within a year or so later, the third one with Clint Eastwood was The Good and Bad and the Ugly. Um, Other interesting thing about Sergio Leone's films, they're always very long. Um, and by the time they got to America, they would actually be shorter. I believe a few more dollars actually there was a lot of concern about the violence. And there's like an American, like 4 minute prelogue, which only shows the back of supposedly Clint Eastwood's head. To give motivation because they didn't want someone to just be out there being violent for violence sake. Um, and then this is the third one, and it had a lot of twists. And actually watched it the other night. It's like 3.5 hours long. There's a couple scenes that were put in, restored a few years ago when it was remastered. And the interesting thing is they got the one actor in this film. Gentleman who played Tuco, actually a New York actor. He came back and looped it. The reason was he needed to loop it because um, they did never used it before in America, so he had to loop it. And it's interesting because he's in his 70s by the time they redid that, and there's definitely a different tone to his voice now. And then the final Western was Once Upon a Time in the West, which is actually one of my favorite films as a child. And they were able to get Henry Fonda, and he played the bad guy in this film. Originally, at the very beginning, there was a scene that they wanted to shoot, and they tried to get Clint Eastwood to do it, but he was unavailable. And they wanted to shoot Clint Eastwood right at the beginning of the film and kill him to kind of be kind of a surprise start to the film. So people thought Clint Eastwood would be the star, and he wasn't. Dominate him and move on. But it's very long and very operatic, has one of the most interesting soundtracks. And Duck You Sucker is actually set a little bit later because there's trains and early automobiles. Um, not my favorite of his films, but it's has a little bit different tone, and it had um, Lee Marvin as the lead in this one. But it's definitely still along the same vein. I think it was kind of Man Against Machine was more the theme here. And then Sergio will stay with him for just a moment. He made one other film, which was Once Upon a Time in America, which is basically an opera about how much he loved America. And that was like a 3.5 hour long film that he did in the late 70s, early 80s. It was basically kind of a gangster film, but it was definitely on the role of his other films, trying to kind of give that same feel and to 30s America, and also quite violent. And then I've got a few of them just while we're there. A few of these I've picked up on Blu-ray, and the picture quality is pretty good on those actually. If you're wanting them, but I would recommend the Sergio Leone films. There's the first three with Clint Eastwood. When Clint Eastwood came to America, his first movie, Hang 'em High, borrowed a lot from these films as well. Kind of had the same tone. And then after that, the floodgates were open, at least after the first one or two of his, and everyone started cranking out these movies. Some better than other. And a lot of them are in public domain. You can pick them up pretty often. Lee Van Cleef kind of had a resurgence. He was actually a bad guy in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. Had not done a lot of, was actually almost considering quitting acting until he got the role in Spaghetti Western, and it revived his career big time. But there's one of his films that Death Rides a Horse, God's Gun, and Cry Blood Apache. A Minute to Die and a minute and a second. I'm sorry, A Minute to Pray, A Second to Die. And then after the Lee Van Cleef took on the role of Sabata for a couple films, and this is almost more in the role the guise of a classic action film. He had kind of a gimmicky gun. Two of them were Lee Van Cleef, and then the third one Yul Brynner stepped into, and I believe that was the Magnificent Seven. But definitely more of an action film, and Yul Brynner's version is much different than Lee Van Cleef, but his character in this is definitely similar to what in the Sergio Leone films. Again, Lee Van Cleef, like I said, you can pick up a lot of his other films. Gun, Grand Duel, several of them are in public domain, so you can pick those up from time to time, cheap. But there was, like I said, a run on them. There was also the Santana series, and as they went on into the 70s, they went into and the Django films, which actually Quentin Tarantino based a couple of his films on some of these films. The Ultra Violence was in a lot of them. Kind of the dark tone and look, and Man Against Industrialist with the single basic hero formulas. But as they went on, and actually got these two as well. I'll show you real quick. There's some nice collections out there with a bunch of them. Like I said, a lot of them are in public domain. You can pick them up. But later in the 70s, they became kind of cheap drive-in films. So they would get Ringo Starr was in a couple of them. A couple other TV stars went on to do this. But the interesting thing about them, they started doing more action. And as they actually took off very well in Japan. This one's a nice collection I picked up somewhere, and it actually has 25 full-length films. Some better than others. I said all dubbed, a lot of noise, a lot of blowing stuff up. Several of the Django films, Santara, but they would mix in comedy, and they would also mix in martial arts, which made it kind of a change up. Eli Wallach also, he was Tuco in the Sergio Leone films, and he came back and did several of him as a star. And interesting, he was a New York theater actor, but played a lot of Mexican roles for some reason. Again, there's a couple more. Trinity was another one that had quite a few films in the series. And then as far as the music, you can't talk about that without talking about Enrico Morricone, who did the soundtrack for all of the Sergio Leone films. And we're hearing a little bit of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which is a nice soundtrack. And this was a big seller. Actually, I've noticed when I started looking for this, actually I have 4 copies of this. So if anyone needs a copy, we can work out a deal. And then there's great music from all 3 of the films. The themes. My personal favorite theme, which I have got the DVD somewhere. There's soundtrack to A Few More Dollars. Is actually Once Upon a Time in the West. Had a darker tone, but the composer there for all these films, Morricone, he's gone on. I believe he's still writing. Ennio Morricone has written hundreds of soundtracks. The Mission, I have to look it up, but he's composed tons of soundtracks, and they're always very operatic, and he's very much into making sure the score enhances the action. So there it is, and that's what I have for this evening. But since you got a lot of time, one thing nice about films, a lot of them are really long, so you'll have plenty of time to watch them while you're sitting in. But again, and that might help you enjoy time. And I don't know if I have much else to add about that. If people have something else you'd like me to talk about, I'd be happy to do that. I will say a lot of the early ones were actually heavily influenced by Japanese directors. Last samurai films basically were rewritten as Americanized westerns with some of the 60s political overtones kind of buried in them. They're always a reflection of the time they were made. All right. Well, thanks for listening. Everyone stay safe out there. I'm working on trying to think of more of a theme type song to play every night. If anyone's got ideas, let me know. Anything you'd like me to change up. Try and make this more interactive as we go along. Everyone be safe. We've made it through another day, and it's thanks to all the healthcare workers I know that are out there. They're doing real work. I just kind of work on the sidelines. And I appreciate everything everyone does. Everyone be safe. Have a good evening, and we will talk to you tomorrow.